had a great day off of math yesterday. Welcome to day 3. Today for our warm-up, I have graphed a sine graph in number 1 and a cosine graph in number 2. What I want you to try to do is think back, access your prior knowledge to transformations to see if on the same graph, can you graph the transformation that is y equals negative sine x? And for number 2, can you graph the transformation of cosine of x? So as you notice, they both have that negative sign out in front for their a value. Can you please graph those to see what would that graph end up looking like? Okay, so as you can recall, when I have a negative a value, the graph will reflect over the x-axis. So I graphed in blue what the negative sign graph would look like. So the differences I see here is when graphing y equals sine x, my graph first goes up to a maximum. And when I was graphing a negative sine x, my point went down to a minimum. Similarly for cosine, I still had a reflection over the x-axis. When I had a positive cosine, my starting point was above my midline. And when I had a negative cosine, my starting point was below my midline. So those facts are going to help us to know when I have a positive or negative sine or cosine by knowing for cosine, is my point starting above or below your midline? Or for sine, is my second point going to be up at a maximum or down at a minimum? All right, today we're going to look at amplitude and period of a graph. So looking at example 1, I have a sine graph. What we learned on Tuesday was that for a sine graph, my first point will be on my midline. And we'll follow this behavior. So if you think about those critical points from that first day, or from on Tuesday, we'd have on, above, on, below, on the midline. So I still have those same 5 points that we talked about on Tuesday, but this would be one cycle or one period of a sine graph. So looking just at this red curve, I know that the period is 2 pi because this one cycle went from 0 to 2 pi. To figure out the amplitude, I want to know the distance from mid to max, which is 2. Now you can also do mid to min. It'll be the same thing. So let's look at a cosine graph. Here I have a negative cosine graph. Since I have a negative cosine graph, I know that my very first point will start below the midline. And if I highlight, whoops, that was a bad highlight. If I highlight just one cycle, again, if I'm thinking of those critical points from on Tuesday, below, on, above, on, below. That's how I know I have one full cycle. So if I look here, one full cycle making that curve was 2 pi. That is my period. And if I wanted to figure out the amplitude, and I think mid to max, from mid to max, I went, let's look over. Ooh, I didn't even get up to that one. I went to 1/2. Now I'm going to ask, can you try the same thing that I just did for the next two? So for C and D, I will give you a hint to get you started. I'm starting with a cosine, positive cosine, one cycle will look like that. And then if I look over at D, I have a negative sign. So start on the midline, go down. That is one cycle of a negative sine graph. Can you please pause this video and see if you can figure out the amplitude and period for C and D? All right, let's check your work for C. My amplitude, the distance from the midline to the maximum, was 3, and the period, so the length of one cycle, was 2 pi. When I look over at D, the amplitude, distance from mid to max, it was at about 1.5, so 3 over 2. And then my period, the length of one cycle, was 2 pi. Can you pause this video one more time? See if you can do E and F. So I would first highlight what does one cycle of a sine or cosine graph look like, and then see if you can figure out the amplitude and the period. Okay, so for E, I highlighted one positive sine cycle. For the amplitude, I found the distance from the midline to the maximum. And then to figure out the period, it's the length of one cycle. This time, I started at 0 and I ended at 4 pi, so my period is 4 pi. When I look at F, let's see, my amplitude mid to max was 1. The period, this time it looked smaller. I started at 0, ended at pi, so my period is pi. So we're starting to see here that the amplitude and period can always be a little bit different. I know the first 4 had periods of 2 pi, and the last 2 did not, so we need to look at where the cycle starts and ends. If you have a question about how do I know where a cycle starts and ends, a recap of Tuesday, a cosine graph will start above or below the midline, and a sine graph will start on the midline and have this shape. So now if I want to figure out the amplitude and period, and if I didn't have any graphs with me, or I didn't want to take the time to graph everyone, I'm actually able to look just at the equation to figure out what the amplitude is. So let's see if I can find a pattern here. If I look at A, my A value was 2, my amplitude was 2. My A value was 1/2 in B, amplitude was 1/2. If I looked at, D underneath, my A value was -3/2, but my amplitude was +3/2. I can jump to E. There was no number in front, so I know there was secretly a 1 there. My amplitude is 1. So whatever my A value is tells me the amplitude, but notice how the amplitude has never been negative because it's a distance from the midline to the maximum. So whenever I am figuring out the amplitude, I can look at whatever the A value is, but make sure it's positive. So the absolute value of your A value. And then now to figure out the period, I know at first it looked like it was always going to be 2 pi, but we saw at the end it ended up being 4 pi or pi. How I will figure out the period, it will be 2 pi over your B value. So having your B value that's inside that X box will help you to figure out the period. And we'll do 2 more examples to practice this. Okay, example 2. Right now, on your paper, write down the amplitude. A value is my amplitude. My amplitude is 7. To figure out my period, for the period, it is 2 pi over B. 2 pi over B. Well, my B value is 4. So 2 pi over 4. And then let's reduce that fraction. Pi over 2. My period is pi over 2. Alright. Please pause this video. Try B. Tell me the amplitude and period. All right, for my amplitude, if you wrote down -2, you are incorrect. That is a wrong answer. Amplitude is the distance from the midline to the maximum. You can never have a negative distance. It is the absolute value of your A value. So please erase your negative sign. The amplitude is +2. So it's always the positive of the A value. For my period is 2 pi over B. So my B value is 1/3. So 2 pi over 1/3. So let's simplify this. I know 2 pi divided by a fraction is the same as multiplying by the reciprocal. The reciprocal of 1/3 is 3/1. And when I multiply straight across, 2 pi times 3 is 6 pi. So my period is 6 pi. And to summarize what we did today, we looked at amplitude and period. So to your summary sheet, this is what you can add for sine and cosine. This is on the front bottom. So I drew a picture to show that basic curve, just like we did on Tuesday. I reminded us what the amplitude is. It's always positive, how you know when you start up or down, and the period.